Liza is our bedtime book club author this week, and we had this incredibly serendipitous moment when we couldn't find a venue for this event. And I thought, who's always booking venues? I know, I'll email some book publicists. And I emailed Picador and said, you know, where's a good venue? And they're like, oh my God, we've got an event that night. Why don't we do an event together? Liza was our bedtime book club author, and it seemed perfect. Now, I read Liza's first book, Tigers in Red Weather, which I adored. So I was really, really excited to be able to work with Liza on this. Liza's going to read from Villa America, just a very short reading, and then we'll have a little chat. Yeah. So over to you.
Thanks. Thank you. I'm actually just so pleased to be here tonight. And to be partnering with the pool and sort of humongous bunch of smart-ass women. I want to also thank my publisher for putting this together, because it's just an amazing moment, and all my friends who came out to see me. So I'm going to read a very quick section from my novel, which is a fictional retelling of the lives of Sarah and Gerald Murphy, who were American expats who lived in Paris and Antibes in the 1920s and found themselves at the center of this literary and artistic community that included F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, Picasso, Léger, Archie McLeish, Cole Porter, and the sort of name dropping goes on. They ended up having a rather tragic life, and that the book sort of does cover that. And this section that I'm going to read to you takes place in 1926. And they've just met Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald for dinner at a casino in a town near Antibes. The dinner has not gone very well. Zelda is this is at a moment when she's, mentally deteriorating, and that's becoming clear to the people around her. And Scott, meanwhile, is sort of becoming extremely alcoholic, if he hadn't already. And they behave terribly. And at a certain point, right before the scene begins, Zelda has thrown herself over a parapet during the dinner to make a point to Scott, who had been flirting with the dancer Isadora Duncan. And then they all decided it was time to go. They were all quiet as they drove down the coast toward Antibes. Zelda had informed them that she and Scott were staying at the Hotel du Cap. When Sarah had asked about their villa, Zelda had replied that there were bats living there, and no one said much after that. Gerald looked out into the darkness. He was thinking about how still it would be now, in Owen's barn. No one would be drunk or throwing themselves off parapets or interrogating their friends about their finances. And yet, he couldn't help remembering their last conversation, lying on that blanket on the ground. You call it a circus, Owen had said, but could you live without it? What do you mean, Gerald had asked, pretending that he hadn't understood what Owen had so clearly meant. Without the spectacle and the costumes and the fucking disguises, the ideas, Jesus, the endless conversations about ideas and the misunderstandings. Could you live without that? Could you, G? Because I could. I can. I do. Gerald had felt angry and had turned away. Why are you asking me impossible questions? Well, then what are we doing here? Is this it? Me here in this field, you in your house, your life, and what? I get to stand at the window and press my face against the glass like some beggar? I'm not a beggar, G. At that point, Gerald had risen and begun to dress. You know, Owen said, standing too, naked. You pretend like you built that house and that wall around it to keep your family safe. But you're lying to yourself. Gerald had turned on him. What about you? Oh, forgive me, I forgot. You're in control of everything. No good luck, no bad luck, just choices. Isn't that what you say? And look how far you've come, he said, spreading his arm around the barn, the shoddy camp bed. Have you told anyone what you are? Not just what you are, but who you are? And don't presume to talk to me about family. What on earth would you know about family? And with that, he turned and left, and he hadn't looked back. Scott? Zelda's voice brought Gerald back to the automobile. Scott? Do you know what we have to do now? Gerald looked at Scott, sitting across from him. Scott? Zelda said it again. Gerald could tell by her tone it wasn't a question. It was payback. Scott lifted his head and looked at his wife. What do we have to do now? Don't you think, Gufo? Don't you think it's just the perfect night to jump off Eden Rock? They were standing, all four of them, on the highest rock, looking down into what would be the sea below if they could see it in the darkness. A 35-foot drop. Gerald knew this from Archie, who took pride in his swan dives off of here, thrilling the children. That was when the sun was up. Zelda stripped down to her underpants, roughly, he could tell from their outline against the night sky, her dress a pool at her feet, then her shoes cast behind her. Gerald was standing next to Scott, who even in the very dim light looked whiter than usual. He could feel him shaking. Gerald thought of being in the ring with the young bull in Pamplona and wanted to tell him, "You don't have to do this." But he felt he couldn't interfere with what was going on between the two of them. It was beyond him, or he was beside the point. Sarah had said nothing either. She must have felt the same way. "Gufo," Zelda said. Scott sat down and took off his shoes. Then he removed his socks, carefully placing them inside. Slowly, a little unsteadily, he stood back up and took off his dinner jacket, handing it to Gerald like something you'd give a friend before a fist fight. He looked at Zelda. "You first," he said. "Don't worry, Scott. My nerves never fail," Zelda said. She walked towards the edge. "Wait," Sarah said suddenly. "No, this is mad. You could kill yourselves." Zelda turned to her and said, "Oh, but Sarah, didn't you know? We're not conservationists." And then she jumped. They heard a splash. Scott looked at them, and he had the saddest look in his eyes that Gerald had ever seen. He looked down at his bare feet, and then, without a word, he followed her off the cliff. Thank you. I probably should have mentioned before that reading that I also wrote a lover-in for Gerald Murphy, who becomes a sort of threesome in this book. But, never mind. It's a little minor detail.
Okay, so for the people in the room who, if there are any, who don't know very much about the Murphys, what was it about them that made you decide to write a book about them?
Well, I was doing my master's degree, and my thesis was on Tender is the Night, which Scott Fitzgerald dedicated to the Murphys and suggested was actually written about them, something that the Murphys objected to greatly because the couple in that, Nicole and Dick Diver, are quite mad. And it ended up actually in a literary fight between Fitzgerald and Hemingway, because Hemingway said it was actually about Scott and Zelda, which does sort of ring closer to the truth. But the dedication says to Gerald and Sarah many fet, and you just got me interested in wondering who these people were, and I started doing research into their lives, and like a lot of people before me, I sort of fell in love with them, and it became, really, really wanted to write about them. I was super attracted to them.
How important do you think, in fact essential, were the Murphys to creating the Lost Generation and that whole Riviera scene?
Yeah, well, it was said about them that they invented summer on the Riviera. So I suppose they were pretty essential. I think in a lot of ways they were muses, and I suppose when muses aren't actors, they become essential glue to holding a group together. So you had a lot of temperamental people in that group of friends, a lot of artists who were competing with each other. And I think that, their sort of calmness and the beautiful life they create in their house in Antibes, which is called Villa America, drew people sort of like moths to the flame.
As you were just saying, the area in which you've taken most artistic license, shall we say, although arguably, is Gerald and Owen's relationship. What was it that made you do that?
Well, when I was doing my research into it, I think, first of all, if you're going to write about the real lives of people, you kind of have to find something that you're going to bring to it, especially as a novelist, that's going to illuminate that story. Otherwise, the biographies have been written. There's really no point. You're just rewriting a biography and fictionalizing it with some dialogue. So for me, I really felt like if I were going to write about them, I had to find a way into that story. And when I started doing the research, it became clear through the letters that Gerald wrote to his wife and to other friends that he struggled with his sexuality. And so at that point, I thought, well, that's the end. That's the thing that's never really been written about. And I think partially because the biographical stuff was written so long ago that it's probably seemed disrespectful to investigate that. And now it doesn't, it come at a very good moment in sort of contemporary history where, we've legislated gay rights. I mean, you can't say that that's somehow disrespectful to suggest someone struggled with something that they were forced to remain hidden. And so I needed to invent a fictional character for him to have sex with. But, there is no suggestion that he actually had an affair, but, I couldn't write a novel either where it's sort of in Gerald Murphy's head for 500 pages, I wish I could. So
Your
I sort of-
editor would have something to say about that.
Yeah, so I had to sort of make his desires flesh and blood, and I found a sort of footnote in one of the biographies I was reading about how Sarah and Gerald had thrown a party for Ernest Hemingway, and it was in the summer on the Riviera, and they had decided to fly in caviar, which was an extremely extravagant thing to do. You couldn't have caviar in the summer in the south of France because it would have to come on the train, it would spoil. So the only way to have it would have been to fly it in, and flying was, it's not like there were like airlines or anything.
Yeah.
So I thought, who is this pilot they found? Who is this guy? And that just sort of planted the seed for the character of Owen, who sort of comes up quickly there, who becomes a sort of a pilot, a World War I fighter pilot, who ends up sort of quite a damaged figure, kind of hanging around in the south of France after the war, and that's where they meet. And so that was, for me, that was the way into that story, and that's where I sort of pegged that the homosexual love story that plays out between the two of them.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? I mean, the Murphys were quite modern characters. What do you think they would have made of your rewrite?
Oof, I don't think they'd be too happy about that. Nobody wants people to start. Making suppositions about the sort of what Eudora Welty calls the private neighborhoods of your mind, and then writing about them. So I'm not sure how happy they'd be. Luckily, they're not with us.
The whole kind of culture of artist patronage has kind of died a death, really. I mean, who do you think the modern day Murphys might be? I think that's a really hard one, because I think one of the things about them, first of all, he was a painter. Gerald himself was an artist. So although a lot of his paintings are lost, some of them are in the MoMA and in the Guggenheims, they're considered quite good. Also, their patronage wasn't money. They weren't these rich people who just sort of gave handouts to artists and hung their work on their walls. They were, the attraction was something about what was in them. It was this home they created that a lot of these people who lived abroad, these expatriates, were fairly transient at that point, found a place to sort of rest and to feel loved and to see, all of this sort of beautiful world they'd created at their house. So there are many nods to modernism, both in terms of the artistic movement, but also the changing world throughout the novel. What do you think the Murphys would have made of our world, and in particular, the internet and social media?
Well, you and I were sort of having this chat, and I think you're right. I think they would have loved Instagram, and I think they would have loved it. They would have loved to have taken pictures of, Sarah had this sort of way of, instead of cutting flowers, she'd arrange parsley on a sort of gold plate or something. And I can sort of imagine a feed full of things like that, and Gerald with his paints, perhaps. I don't know about Facebook. I don't know. I'm not sure they would have sort of, updated their status so much. I see them more as the photograph types.
I reckon they'd be the over-styled Instagram picture, that kind of fake life.
Make everyone sick with envy kind of thing.
And then Zelda would have been the loose cannon on Twitter.
Yeah, on Twitter, drunk. The martinis drunk. Yeah.
She'd be drinking and tweeting. Now, I read somewhere, I'm going off piece for my last question. I read somewhere that your next book is set in Martha's Vineyard in the 80s. Is that right? That's
right. Wow, word travels fast. It is. Yeah.
Just tell me a little bit about that before we wrap up.
Okay. It's going to be about this music executive, an A&R executive, who has lost his ear, so he's lost his ability to hear hits. And he sort of came up to power in the 60s, and it's now the 80s, and he can't connect with the culture, he can't connect with the music, and he gets sort of spectacularly fired, and he goes to sort of stay with some friends who he sort of dicked over in the past. And it's through a sort of redemptive relationship with their teenage son that he comes back, that he can finally reconnect with himself and maybe see himself clearly.
Do you see parallels with the 20s Riviera and the Martha's Vineyard culture of the 80s?
I think, the thing the books will probably all have in common is that I have, I'm obsessed with groups, with the gangs, whether it be your family gang or whether it be your gang of friends or whatever it is. But I think that sort of ensemble piece is what attracts me. And the 80s is, for me, such a nostalgic time. It's my childhood time, so it's linked with such intense memory,
Thanks. But Liza's amazing book is in your goodie bag tonight, which is quite unusual for a book launch based on any that I've been to. It's also the Bedtime Book Club on the pool tonight, but you don't actually need to go to the pool tonight for your free extract because you've got the book. Thank you, Liza, very much.
Thank you, Sam. That's so much fun. Thanks a lot.